I'm moderating our event. I'm very glad that you've all come. I just want to remind everyone, although I think many of the people here have been here before, that this is the whole concept of these meetings is that we come to learn things we don't know from people who know better than we do about issues that are related to, but not necessarily specifically about, events that are happening in Israel and Gaza. And that the point is to learn, to be instructed, to have a good conversation, and not to have any violent fights among ourselves. And people who have strong opinions, and many of us do, or strong emotions, I think we all have those, but we want to keep them out of this particular forum and express them elsewhere. So this is more of an academic educational event, and I think that we've all profited from all the talks that we've had up to now, and I'm sure we will profit from the current talk. So I'd like just to introduce our speaker, Eugene Shepard, who is an associate professor of modern Jewish history and thought and director of the History of Ideas program and associate director of the Tauber Institute for the Study of European History and associate editor of the Tauber Institute series with Brandeis University Press. And his area of expertise or areas include modern European Jewish intellectual history, history of Jewish nationalism and Zionism, and modern European intellectual history and the history of continental philosophy. So many of these areas obviously are relevant to our discussion today. He is the author of Leo Strauss and the Politics of Exile, The Making of a Political Philosopher, which came out with Brandeis University Press, and he recently co-edited a volume titled The Individual and History, Essays in Honor of Yehuda Reinhardt. And among other things, he and Samuel Moyn of, I think he's at Yale now, no? He's at Yale, because it says Harvard here, but are managing editors of the multi-volume Brandeis Library of Modern Jewish Thought on Brandeis University Press. And today, as you can see, he will talk to us about historical reflections on academic freedom, universities, and democracies in times of crisis and war. So thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours, Eugene.
Thank you. Is that good? Thank you for inviting me, Omer. So I should say that my presentation will not focus explicitly or centrally on Israel-Gaza, but more I'm going to try to do something funky, which is try to place in relief a lot of the current debates that we're all surrounded by in terms of debates about academic freedom in the United States, Israel, Palestine, Europe, and look to a surprising source, or an unlikely source, perhaps, for an inspiration to get a different take on what academic freedom might entail, shifting away from typical American concerns about civil liberties and notions of freedom of expression, instead getting to more fundamental questions about what is the purpose of the university? What is distinctive about the profession of someone who devotes their life and work to the academy? What is the status of a student on a university campus? What is the status of a university president or board of trustees in comparison to a student or faculty member? And so the unlikely person that I'll eventually visit will be a very conservative historian who was a medievalist by the name of Ernst Kantorowicz, but I'll get to him in a minute. First, does anyone know what that gown is that's on this slide? Michelle, you must know. Right. So that's the brown graduation gown, okay? And the gown that we don, usually once a year, is going to feature a kind of a central role in today's talk in getting us to think about what it is to embody, to personify certain ideas and ideals about the university. It's going to be a different take on political theology, but I'll get to that in a second. When Omer first asked me to give a talk, I happened to be reading this new book by Wendy Brown, who's a political theorist, now at the Institute for Advanced Studies, was at Berkeley for several years before that, and she writes this book, Nihilistic Times, Thinking with Max Weber. Like Kantorovich, Weber was a pretty conservative intellectual. He was not an historian, but a sociologist. And Brown happens to look at what was happening at the time that Max Weber gave these two incredible lectures. I'm not sure if you've read them. One is called Science as a Vocation, Wissenschaft als Beruf, which I'll talk about the translation question in a second, which he gave in 1917. So this was during when World War I, Germany was still engaged in battle. And this was clearly in the background to a lot of his worries and a lot of his concern for the nature of the academy and what it means to be a professor in a time of war. And then the second lecture that's usually connected, instead of science as a vocation, it's politics as a vocation. Politik als Beruf. Now, in each case, first of all, science is a little bit misleading. In English, we normally think of science as being the hard sciences, natural sciences. Wissenschaft in German, Weber was tapping into kind of a more capacious understanding of systematic approaches to knowledge. So the humanities are very much within that penumbra of the meaning of Wissenschaft. Now, the other term in that title, Beruf, the normal English translation is vocation, and I think in contemporary German, this is what most the common rendering would be. But Beruf has a pre-modern meaning, which is the notion of a calling. So, for example, Luther writes about Beruf all the time. He has a calling that gives him a certainty in the world. Danny, in terms of notions of knowledge, his calling makes him certain of his knowledge and certain of his world. Weber's dealing with the secularization of this notion of, instead of being called to serve as clergy for the church, for example, what it means to have a calling in a secular sphere, so to speak, within the academy. And there's a kind of slippage and interesting playfulness that he has in that text, where he's dealing with this overall loss in the modern world of those theological supports that used to undergird people in their life's work. And in 1917, all of these foundations seem to have been eroded. And as Wendy Brown tries to investigate, she asks you, what is this challenge of nihilism more generally? How can the academy counter problems of the loss of meaning, loss of certainty, loss of sense of value in the world? The second lecture that he gives, Politics as Vocation, also taps into that secularization of the meaning of this term, which used to be calling, but now is just a mere professional vocation. The first one he gave during the war. The second one he gave after Germany had surrendered. And now this is an age of revolution in Munich. And he's giving it while there was the Spartacist Republic. And there's counter-revolutionary forces outside the university. These counter-revolutionary forces, many of them were part of the Freikorps. I'll get to them with Kantorowicz in a second, because Kantorowicz was a member of the Freikorps, not in Munich at this time of his talk, but in Berlin. But then just in a few months later, Kantorowicz will be in Munich suppressing the revolutionary government in Munich from a virulently anti-communist, monarchist, authoritarian, right-wing paramilitary organization, the Freikorps. Okay, so this brings us to Ernst Kantorowicz. Kantorowicz is probably best known for his book called The King's Two Bodies, which is an impossible book to read. It's filled with just so much, and it just zigzags all over the place, but it basically deals with a legal fiction. It deals with the notion of, well, it's there when the king dies and you say, the king is dead, long live the king. One body is natural. One body of the king is natural. That body becomes infirmed, can make mistakes, is finite. The other body, the body of the office, so to speak, is eternal. And that's the essential body. So this is, he calls it Chapters in Medieval Political Theology. So the book opens up with this quotation. Mysticism, when transposed from the warm light of myth and fiction to the cold searchlight of fact and reason, has usually little left to recommend itself. Its language, unless resounding within its own magic or mystic circle. Kantorowicz was really quite concerned and devoted to notions of magic and mystic circles, will often appear poor and even slightly foolish, and its most baffling metaphors and high-flown images, when deprived of their iridescent wings, may easily resemble the pathetic and pitiful sight of Baudelaire's albatross. Political mysticism, in particular, is exposed to the danger of losing its spell or becoming quite meaningless when taken out of its native surroundings, its time and its place. So this book goes on to affect a number of people, not only fellow conservatives, but perhaps famously or infamously Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish cites Kantorowicz as one of the inspirations for taking his own approach to this problem of to sovereignty and questions of political theology. Okay, oops, this is a little bit. This is an image of Stefan Georg, and I'll get to him in a second. I'll give a formal introduction to get to how Kantorowicz gets connected to Stefan Georg. While framing an intellectual's work in light of her deeds and other biographical concerns can often lead to overreadings of her texts, sometimes the intellectual historian can illuminate, albeit complicated, long-held understandings of those figures. German Jewish figures on the political right provide embarrassing exceptions to an otherwise romanticized embrace of the pantheon of dissident figures who emerged out of Weimar and were sent into exile during the 1930s. The case of Ernst Kantorowicz, 1895 to 1963, offers a remarkable case study of how a shifting, principled commitment, a set of commitments characterize his scholarship, but also impact cultural areas seemingly far afield from medieval scholarship. Beyond Kantorowicz's well-known and more obscure academic writings, I should point out that he also lived through and forcefully responded to 3 striking episodes wherein the political loyalties of the professorate came under scrutiny. First, in Germany, under National Socialism, he wrote letters of protest to the ruling Nazi regime that he had been unjustly treated and unjustly excluded from the national community to which he had devoted his life and work. Then, World War II, acting and writing on behalf of a friend and fellow medieval scholar who had been stripped of his position due to his participation with the National Socialist regime during the denazification of German universities that was instituted under the Allied occupation of Germany. And then the third moment we'll look at is when he rose to the fore in both speech and writing against the imposition of an anti-communist loyalty oath at the University of California, Berkeley. These 3 responses reveal an evolution in his principled defense of academic freedom. But what is perhaps even more relevant for us, given Kantorowicz's astonishing importance for the modern study of political theology, the figure of the scholar, the tenured professor, and even the student become invested with a type of sacral dignity, one which marks an inner sovereignty within the eternal corporate body of the university. This development is situated against his earlier efforts to inspire a rebirth of ruler worship, emerging from his participation in the cosmic circle around Stefan Georg. They were known as the Georgians, as well as his later magisterial critical studies of ruler worship, which took place from the 1930s until his death in 1963. So let us begin by turning our attention to the tensions between Kantorowicz's American and German careers and the episodes wherein political interventions around universities prompted his pointed responses. Let's start with the most recent one in 1949. In 1949, some 400 members of the University of California, Berkeley faculty attended a special meeting of its academic senate to discuss a newly discovered requirement by the University of California Board of Regents that all professors of the university be required to take a loyalty oath. The first speaker of the faculty that came down to speak was a respected professor of psychology known for his active pacifism by the name of Edward Tolman. Tolman presented a resolution which affirmed the loyalty and patriotism of all the California Berkeley faculty and requested that the requirement of the loyalty oath be stricken only because it may pose questions regarding academic freedom and tenure. The next member of the faculty to walk down to the front of the auditorium and speak was the 44-year-old medieval historian Ernst Hartwig Kantorowicz. Kantorowicz was born into a wealthy, cultivated, and German-identifying Jewish family in Posen, or Poznan. His father had established a profitable multinational liquor company. They had offices in San Francisco, Poland, Germany, England. Ernst Kantorowicz had burst onto Germany's interwar public scene as the author of a brilliant and controversial 1927 biography of the medieval Hohenstaufen Emperor Kaiser Friedrich II, a book which became venerated by so many figures of the far European right, including Mussolini, Goring, and Hitler himself. These are some pictures of people connected to Stefan Georg. This is pre-World War I. Georg, they all referred to Stefan Georg as the Meister, and it was a very a strong hierarchy with the master on top and the devoted disciples who tried to prove their devotion to beauty and art. And it was a very strong homosocial environment dominated by young men, although Kantorowicz's cousin will be a female exception to the circle. They're receive a bunch of, it's a close-knit and highly competitive group of young men that surround the master. They're all connected to different universities, but outside the universities. And they see themselves as a natural cultural aristocracy. And you can see, the eroticism is deliberate in a lot of the photographs that were taken and a lot of the etchings that they made of each other in the circle. There was a lot of cross-dressing, a lot of interesting gender bending going on to make what was called this magic circle of the Georgians. After 1904, when one of the young devotees of the circle died at just the young age of 16, this figure, Maximum, Max Conrad August Kronberger, became a venerated figure and really at the center of a kind of cult worship by the Georgians. So they devote several poems to him in his memory, and you can see the beautiful illustrations in terms of bookmaking that the Georgians played with at the time. I mean, they're just the Jugendstil style. It just they put a lot of care into aesthetics. So Kantorowicz on the left, that's him. I think he's a teenager at that time, probably around 15, 14 years old, I believe. And then later there's a picture of him in America, in California. He might be at Princeton already in that picture. But Kantorowicz was part of this circle. So this is that book on Frederick II that I mentioned. You'll notice that on this Bondi publication, there appears to be a swastika in the middle of the frontispiece, although I think it's inverted, right? From what the Nazi symbol is. Okay, it looks like a good swastika. Okay, but the point that the Bondi Press and the Blatter für die Kunst, which is the larger publisher that would publish Georgian works from the early 1900s forward, used this symbol as well as other kind of cultic symbols as kind of esoteric messages to other members of the society. And this was before the Nazis had appropriated the Indian symbol. Okay. So back to Kantorowicz in America, and then I'll zigzag back to Frederick II book to tell you what's going on with it. So 2 decades after the publication of this book, when Kantorowicz came to that faculty senate meeting in 1949, he read a prepared statement in what one eyewitness described as, quote, a strange rhythmical incantation, high-pitched with fervor. Kantorowicz began his remarks, quote, as a conservative historian who has studied loyalty oaths, one thing becomes clear. It is the harmless oath that hooks. It hooks before it has undergone those changes that will render it bit by bit less harmless. Mussolini Italy of 1931, Hitler Germany of 1933 are terrifying and warning examples of the harmless bit-by-bit procedure in connection with politically enforced oaths. End quote. The UC Regent's oath may appear harmless, Kantorovich averred, but it has the potential to destroy the most essential attributes of the professor, his very personification of humanitas and dignitas, humanity and dignity. By forcing the faculty to take the oath under duress of losing their jobs, it amounts to economic coercion and approaches blackmail. Its logic is taken from, quote, modern and bygone dictatorships. For Kantorovich, the fundamental issue at stake is that of professional and human dignity. Okay, so on the right is a sarcophagus that is in Palermo for Frederick II, and the preamble to the work begins with these words. Italy's May 1924 celebration, so this is Mussolini, Italy, the 700th anniversary of the University of Naples. So Mussolini liked to enshrine his own acclamations with university and professorial support, as other dictators did as well. Kantorovich writes, a wreath could be seen on the sarcophagus of the emperor in the Cathedral of Palermo, which reads, "To its emperors and heroes, the secret Germany." Okay, now there's a lot going on here, that you have a German emperor who's being studied as a image of ruler worship, who nevertheless doesn't seem to be German. His sarcophagus is in Italy, it's in Palermo, so there's a kind of exile for this forgotten hero, forgotten ruler, that is worshipped by what he thinks is the most essential part of Germany, and that is this secret Germany that holds its true essence. In the preamble, he states that what this symbolizes is, quote, the great enthusiasm which goes beyond that of learned circles for the great German rulers of the past in a day when emperors are no more. So in 1927, he certainly is calling for the days of when we could aspire to great emperors again. Instead, we're stuck with the pathetic spectacle of a Weimar Republic, for example. Okay. Now, Kantorovich's allusions at Berkeley to German and Italian fascism then proved to be rhetorically powerful in galvanizing the faculty against the oath. But they also point to Kantorovich's previous commitments to a simultaneously cosmopolitan and intransigently nationalist, imperial, authoritarian, and intransigently anti-communist politics in Germany. Indeed, his aforementioned self-description as a conservative historian doesn't quite do justice to the several self-descriptions he had given in the previous 3 decades. However, Kantorovich would now seek to redress some of his earlier words and gestures. The American Kantorovich came to look upon his earlier embrace and quest for nationalist models of heroism and leader worship as misguided and dangerous. But what elements of his earlier positions remain intact, and what elements were modified rather than wholly rejected? And how does this relate to the university? As was common for many wounded combat soldiers in World War I, Kantorovich often invoked his service. He also never tired of advertising additional voluntary participation in the counter-revolutionary actions of the aforementioned Freikorps. I should note that though Jewish participation in various Freikorps units was not exactly statistically that significant, it's pretty small, but there still have yet to be really hard numbers overall of how many Jews did participate. I assume overall it would be under 5%, but nevertheless, It's a pretty loud 5% of those who participated, and it just shows us how broad the political spectrum was at the time for Germans who were Jewish. Kantorowicz viewed his service in World War I and in the Freikorps as a crucial element, establishing his bona fides as a figure on the right, a matter which I shall emphasize in a few moments. After being introduced to Stefan George by his cousin Gertrude Kantorowicz, 1876 to 1945, Ernst Kantorowicz became a leading figure associated with the Georgikreis. Gertrude Kantorowicz was herself a poet, as well as a gifted scholar of art and architectural history, from ancient Greece to medieval Europe, and became a translator of Henri Bergson into German, and would go on to edit the works of Georg Simmel, who she had a daughter with, Simmel as well. In 1942, she was deported to Theresienstadt, where she died in 1945. She left behind a set of prison poetry, which was posthumously published. She was one of the only women to publish amongst the Georgian official publishing volumes, published on Blätter für die Kunst in 1899. In other words, she at least temporarily found a way in to this otherwise quite strong citadel of a homosocial circle, of a self-anointed true aristocracy, culturally as well as politically. Ernst Kantorowicz went on to earn his doctorate in the history of economics at the University of Berlin. While his dissertation looked to medieval economic history of Ottoman lands, it was his book published in 1927 that really catapulted him to have an international reputation. This book on Frederick II sold over 15,000 copies by 1938 and appeared in 5 editions by 1938. His portrait of Frederick II was intended to remind his German contemporaries of the greatness Germany once had. This is a Germany now that's been defeated. It was explicitly intended to inspire that secret Germany to lift itself out of its Weimar malaise and recover its lost other Germany, its image and legacy of world historical leadership. The book's tone and method were famously attacked by Albert Brachmann at an opening of the Prussian Academy of Sciences, summarized in a Berlin daily newspaper, and then published in the flagship historical journal, Historische Zeitschrift, as a dangerous precedent of an historical appropriation of myth rather than a piece of serious critical history. He called it Mythenschau. The second edition of Frederick II biography appeared in 1931, and in response to Brachmann's criticisms, it included an appended volume of annotations, which awed so many of his earlier critics, although not Brachmann, by detailing meticulously the wealth of sources he used in developing his portrait of a medieval hero. Kantorowicz combined a rigorous and dazzling mastery over medieval resources in multiple languages in the conscious effort to draw a portrait of a poet's emperor. Kantorowicz's book, along with his replies to his critics, not only earned him an honorary professorship at the University of Frankfurt, but then a full-fledged professor ordinarius in 1932. Meanwhile, something happens in Germany. Adolf Hitler comes to power, the Nazis come to power, and Kantorowicz is forced to step back from the university in 1933 and 1934. Being Kantorowicz, he writes several letters of protest to the National Socialist regime, which is a little bit crazy, in which he protests that how could you strip me of my university professorship and my involvement to the national community that I helped build. But then, when we come back to America in 1949 through 1951, he self-publishes this book about the loyalty oath called The Fundamental Issue. The lawyers for the professors who refused to sign the oath, in the end there were only 8 who refused to sign the oath, they urged him not to publish this because they were worried it was going to hurt the court case and worried it would hurt in public opinion. It's a medievalist account of why the loyalty oath is wrong. And it's just so bizarre that I think it makes it so interesting and fascinating for us to resituate what all of academic freedom might be. Okay. So in the prefatory note to Fundamental Issue, he says, why I did not sign the oath, although or because I am not and never have been a communist, and although or because I am genuinely conservative and have never been taken for anything else. What the fundamental issue is has been obvious to me from the minute the controversy started. Perhaps I have been sensitive because both my professional experience as an historian and my personal experience in Nazi Germany have conditioned me to be alert when I hear again certain familiar tones sounded. Rather than renounce this life experience, which is indeed synonymous with my life, I shall place it for what it's worth at the disposal of my colleagues who are fighting the battle for the dignity of their profession and their university. And then he proceeds to give his bona fides, talking about his involvement with the Freikorps and his anti-communist activities. This kind of echoes these earlier responses he had to National Socialism. I give an English translation of some of these letters that he wrote, not only in 1933, but all the way through 1938. Each year he sends in letters of protest, expecting this injustice to be overturned. This is the last such letter he writes on October 16th, just a few days before Kristallnacht, saying that, look, I'm the guy who participated in these anti-communist, anti-socialist military actions, the actions of the Ministry of Education forcing me into an early retirement have tarnished the standing of the German university, and I'm confident that my position will soon rightfully be restored. Okay, I don't think he really thought that was going to happen, but he wanted to make that point. Okay, I'll move ahead a little bit more quickly through. Here's where Kantorowicz explains his kind of metaphysics of what the university is. It would be putting the cart before the horse to maintain that the professors do not serve the university, but serve the regents, a board, and that consequently they are not officers of the university, but employees of the regents. Has a specter or has megalomania wrought havoc with proportions and contours? Does the university exist for the sake of the regents, or do the regents exist for the sake of the university, of a public institution instituted by the body of teachers and students? Here he also starts talking about the importance of conscience that is unique to the profession, and the kind of scandal of what it is to demoralize this scholarly conscience, which has a certain dignity that is now being offended here. And here he says, I'm not talking about political expediency or academic freedom, nor even about the fact that an oath taken under duress is invalidated the moment it is taken, but wish to emphasize the true fundamental issue at stake, professional and human dignity. And here we come to the robes. There are 3 professions which are entitled to wear a gown: the judge, the priest, the scholar. This garment stands for its bearer's maturity of mind, his independence of judgment, and his direct responsibility to his conscience and to his God. It signifies the inner sovereignty of those three interrelated professions. They should be the very last to allow themselves to act under duress and yield to pressure. It is a shameful and undignified action. It is an affront and a violation of both human sovereignty and professional dignity that the regents have dared to bully the bearer of this gown into a situation which, under the pressure of bewildering economic coercion, he is compelled to give up either his tenure or, together with his freedom of judgment, his human dignity and his responsible sovereignty as a scholar. So I'll just say that viewing all these really nice praisings of the academic freedom of the scholar, it sits a little bit funny when we see these letters that he writes for former friends who were high up in the Nazi regime, like Percy Ernst Schramm, clearing them of their participation during the Third Reich. We can talk about that a little bit more in question period. I'll just point out that another person that came to the defense together with Kantorowicz is an historian who taught at Brown for a short period after the war by the name of Hans Rotfels. Professor Bartov is familiar with Rotfels' controversies as it relates to the Holocaust, and maybe we can deal with that as well. Another complicated person of Jewish background who converts, but was also in exile during the Third Reich. Anyways, I think at this point we should open things up to questions.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. So, yes, please, questions. And remember to turn this on and introduce yourselves.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I'm a junior here at Brown studying history. And I guess my question's, pretty simple. I guess to this philosophy, is there a line that is drawn at all, or is this kind of an absolutist view of, like, academic freedom, that they're freedom, that there should be no lines?
I mean, for him, the gown does represent inner sovereignty that cannot be touched by state authority, by the board of trustees, or mere administrators like a president of a university or a chancellor of a university. The fundamental mistake that people make is viewing faculty as employees. So one thing I should make clear, this is clearly, when I said medieval, this is an anti-democratic understanding of the dignity of those who wear the robes, but it's really powerful. But he doesn't draw any limits. He assumes that there is a kind of responsibility that scholar will personify. But it's a real problem of where would those limits go. And you can see with someone like Percy Ernst Schramm, who he cleared of any participation with the Third Reich, even though he ends up collecting these things called Hitler's table talks. He was very close to the high command and saw war crimes firsthand and doesn't report any of them. There doesn't seem to be those limits. This is his friend who helped save him to get out of Germany in '38, and because he wears the robes, he shouldn't be fired.
So, follow-up question. What would he say about, when you say, like, he doesn't draw any lines, what would he say about, like, I guess, extreme revisionism to the point of, making, someone wearing the robes, just making something up, like, Holocaust denial, for example?
Well, I think there would be a question of self-policing, that the profession would police real from fake scholars. Paradoxically, of course, he was being policed when he wrote his Frederick II biography, but then he stunned everyone that he actually wasn't making this stuff up. It wasn't just a poetic imagination. He was dealing with an incredible array of sources, from coinage to liturgical texts. It's quite amazing.
Hi, I'm Toss. I think so.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so.
Hi, I'm Toss. I'm a sophomore studying comp bio and potentially history. And I'm really glad you gave this talk because I write a column about higher education and I've written like 3 pieces about academic freedom, one of which came out today.
Oh, wow. I'll have to wait.
Yeah, in
I'd
the
like to
Brown
read
Daily
that,
Herald.
yeah.
It was about institutional neutrality. So I have 2 questions. One about the talk specifically. How do you think just the fact that the Nazi regime was so against people like him, how do you think that fact influences thinking about this? Like if the Nazis, if he wasn't a Jew, for example, would he have like had a similar like evolution of his position? So I'll let you answer that question first, and then I have a more contemporary question.
Yeah, it's hard to engage in speculations about that counterfactual. It's a great question. I can look to his friends Hans Rothfeld, who taught here, who kept trying to get to be officially declared Aryan, even though he was, including from one of his students was Joachim Ribbentrop. He was unsuccessful in getting that kind of kosher certificate, so to speak, being an Aryan. I don't know if Kantorovich, if he didn't have direct Jewish blood, would he have changed his mind? I don't know. I mean, Schramm, he might have just been another Schramm. Schramm after the war doesn't do anything really nasty like Rothfeld does. But he's a disturbing, difficult kind of figure. So I don't know. The thing is, he was Jewish, and so it did affect him.
Yeah. What did Rothfeld do again?
He was an historian. Yeah, he wasn't a medievalist. And he, in terms of Holocaust controversies, he famously or infamously said, well, let's not look at crimes in the East.
And then my second question is about, like, I guess more contemporary issues in academic freedom. So when you were giving this talk, what struck me was, like, I guess the continuance of these ideas, like from Kantorovich, which I've never heard of, to, like, the Calvin Report, to, like, further just ideas of what it means to be a scholar and your autonomy within that. And then recently there's been a lot of like expectations that universities make stances on things and or like condemn its scholars for works that they don't consider within the social norms. For example, Amy Wax or there was a Kelly Hoover, I think, at Harvard. And so I guess like what do you see the role of the university in itself as its corporate body, policing its scholars, but also like taking stances, which by definition, like at least has an undue influence on scholars.
Right. I mean, I should say that by predisposition, I'm skeptical of mystical notions of corporate bodies, like the way Kantorovich wants to view the university. Although I am struck by his hierarchy that it's the faculty and the students that are the essential parts. And these other parts, which, I mean, now I think are really coming to the fore, whether it be Congress or boards of trustees, potential donors, university presidents, DEI officials, other educational consultants, all people who do not wear the robes. They've become empowered and they think the professors serve them. And Kantorovich, I think, was onto something that, wait a minute, does the university exist to kind of meet certain budget targets and raise a certain amount of money and serve the interests of educational experts? And he was trying to twist it in an interesting way. Now, there is a kind of anti-labor perspective from Kantorovich. He basically says we the professors are not gardeners or custodians. You know, we have greater dignity.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that. I mean, in thinking about greater issues of academic freedom, I'm still the Democrat in me is worried, well, what entitles me as someone in the sphere of the academy? Why should I enjoy certain rights and freedoms that Joe Smith doesn't have on the street? I think Kantorovich answers that partially, but I'm not willing to go to this mystical world of the magic circle that he wants to just hop into.
Hi, I'm Maya. I'm a junior and I'm studying history. So, I mean, not obviously many professors don't see themselves this way, but I think we've seen recently, and not just since the beginning of the war, but in the past decade or so, that a lot of professors see themselves as academics/activists. And I was wondering if you knew when that started and why. And then the second part to that question, how that affects free inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, at least in terms of the modern period, universities themselves were founded in political moments. I mean, if you look at his model of the university is a medieval one, but the modern German university has this mythology about Alexander von Humboldt in the early 19th century, which comes in opposition over against Napoleonic subjugation. So, like, we Germans, we need our own kind of image of humanistic pursuits that can serve the nation and the state in productive ways. And the more open ways tend to be emphasized in terms of the nostalgia for von Humboldt. But already there was a kind of political activism expressed over against Napoleonic subjugation, at least with regard to Humboldt in Berlin. But it's a great question about America. It does seem to be more common, but I mean, Kantorovich himself has actually been portrayed as an activist scholar by using this text, the fundamental issue. People don't read it. They just see, oh, he spoke up for freedom of speech and defending against loyalty oaths. He was a liberal activist. He would have hated liberal activists. So I think one thing he would have recognized is that we're all political creatures. And even our scholarship has political tones and political impetus behind it. And that's part of where our passions go. And driving us to how we become curious about the world and how we devote ourselves to understand things better. He did have some faith that our commitment to the profession, the dignity and the humanity of the profession would serve as guardrails. But, is it Andrew? As Andrew pointed out, where are the guardrails there of, like, when nationalist or other types of activist ideological commitments take precedence over pure scholarship? I think he would still leave it to matters of self-policing, but I don't think he'd see that much of a problem with. Although it's interesting, he had a profound effect upon a group of mostly queer poets in San Francisco and Berkeley that were his students, and they start magazines like called The Circle. So they obviously knew where he was coming from in terms of the Georgian circle, and most of them did not turn out to be academics, these poets, but they really take this same kind of creative spirit that that just really comes alive in a way that it's unfamiliar to the everyday. And there's a kind of an aesthetic lifting up and embrace of things like the material and the body, which has an unapologetic aesthetic about it. So I'm not sure if they weren't exactly political activists, other than some of them became because they were openly gay, that would have had some influence. And he had no issue with that, but he wouldn't have had. And he died in '63. I don't think he would have had much patience for the student free speech movement at Berkeley that came just a few years later.
I just want to take the prerogative and also ask you a question. I think this is a fascinating discussion, really, and I wish we had more of it. And I'm trying to think through some of what you were saying. So it looks like for Kontrovic, what we are speaking about, or what he is imagining, is really the university as a corporation. And it's within that framework of a corporation whose real members, of course, are the faculty themselves, represented by the gown. It has its own status, as it did in medieval times. And the opposite of that is, in fact, the kind of what was created in Germany, which he was part of, is the university professor as a Beamte, as a
Absolutely.
bureaucrat.
Absolutely.
So he's under the state, which is a very different idea from the American one. And when you move from the United States to Germany, you realize in Germany you are under particular bureaucratic rules,
And-
which are not.
And it's something that Weber's essay deals
Yes,
directly with.
exactly.
Right.
So this
As
is
a vocation, a
Yes.
profession, not as a calling.
yes, and now so this is one aspect of it that I think is interesting to think about. The other is between the okay, so we have the scholar who does scholarship, and then we have one option is this kind of political activism, right? Which would have been frowned upon by Kontrovic, and I don't think that's what he has in mind. But the other is the academic or the scholar as a public intellectual, as someone who expresses views about contemporary events, but through his or her knowledge, which provides them with a particular legitimacy. And I wonder, so that's the first question, what do you think he would have thought of that? And many German scholars today, I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, even more, had that position and even had the spaces in the feuilleton and these newspapers where they could pontificate in that sense. That's one question that I'm interested in. The other one is really, I mean, his history is so extraordinary, and there's several such characters. You mentioned Rothfuss, there's Viktor Klemperer, who stayed in Germany and was very conservative and ends up being in communist Germany, choosing that, and extremely anti-Zionist as well. A real patriot, a real German patriot. And I'm thinking, along the lines of what was asked earlier, it appears like Kantorowicz would have wanted to remain in Germany as a professor. He didn't because he couldn't,
Correct.
but he would if he could.
Yes.
What do we make of that? And I think he would have admitted it. What do we make of that in terms of how we understand his position at Berkeley? What is he actually saying? Because he likely would not have been forced to make an oath in Germany, I don't think, but he would have had to become part of the Guild, the National Socialist.
Right. So
Guild. What do we make of
So
that?
part of this
Is
first.
he just hypocritical? What I'm trying to understand, your understanding, is he just hypocritical, or is there actually some truth to what he's saying that we find it difficult to square?
Right. I mean, one reason why I'm so fascinated by figures like Kantorowicz, he seems to be impossible because of what
Mhm.
I was expecting of what we think of these. Oh, a refugee German Jewish intellectual is supposed to be this and this and this, but
Yeah.
it doesn't match up. The first letter of protest against. So in 1933, German faculty had to take a loyalty oath to the Führer. Now, he was not fired in 33 because he was a wounded veteran
No.
from World War I. But he protested that he couldn't take the oath to Hitler. Now, he couldn't take the oath because he was not an Aryan.
Yeah.
So why won't you let me take the oath? I mean, there's something pathological there, right?
So that's a great moment.
Yeah, no, right. So I mean,
So he protests for not being able to take the oath in 33.
In
And
33.
he protests in 49 for having to take the oath.
yes, well, in 49, he said, look, and he kind of fudges it. In 49 to 51, he says, look, I was asked to do this in 33. I learned my lesson. He didn't say exactly
Right.
his own pathological response, but each and every year up to 1938, he kept writing these protest letters. It was like, how could you exclude me from this national community? I'm one of you guys. I'm secret Germany. That's my idea. So
But you
there's
don't think he's hypocritical. Because then it makes it easy.
no. I mean I think so. I think there's this isn't original with me. I think there is a transition from hero worship to worship of the scholar. There's a kind of depoliticized understanding of how the scholar ends up being what the emperor used to be in terms of his hero worship. And you get this sense when he's writing about great medieval jurisprudence thought. You know, he's in love with the majestic thinking of these thinkers. There are certainly contradictions and paradoxes. I don't think he's a hypocrite. He could have just signed the oath, and he refused to do it on principle. But no one paid attention as to why, and that his curious argument is filled with all kinds of problems. But I think it's really provocative still.
Yeah.
I forget your name, Todd. So, Todd. I'd love to read your current pieces because I don't see in much of the debates about academic freedom and what are universities. I don't see many of these kind of fundamental questions going on about. They think they'll sound silly if they go to metaphysics. But existentially, what are we? What is our purpose? Are faculty different than businessmen? I mean, right. The other thing that I was going to get at in terms of for those of us who take special classes and teach special classes, you come out of those classes different than when you entered it. And that kind of transformational experience, that's what the circle's about. And so I don't know how often that happens in other workplaces, but I think that's the purpose that universities and educators, we aspire to get to that transformational experience, both for the students as well as the teacher herself.
Ben?
Could you go back to the slide that describes the gown and what I want to say is yes. Who are the three? Yeah.
Oh, the three. Okay, sorry.
We've got the
There.
priest, the judge, okay,
Right.
and the scholar. So, as a historian of religion in my origins, I can only see here, the Protestant footprints everywhere.
No, this is Catholic.
He's Catholic, but
No, he's Jewish, but this is Catholic points of reference for him.
I tend to disagree, and I'll explain why. But at least if you democratize this point, it becomes very similar to the argument of the Protestants. Fundamentally, you can see here the origins of academia in religion, which places the connection between God and human consciousness in the hands of the priest, which is where the magic happens. And therefore it needs to be protected and has to be defended. And similarly with the scholar who retained the same connection. In his later...
And same with the judge.
Yeah, same with the judge. In his objection to the Berkeley or the UC loyalty oath, you can see how that can become highly democratic, because what it means is that, okay, let's start with the judge and with the priest and with the scholar, but isn't everybody entitled to their own consciousness on the basis of this religious sort of religious background? Not necessarily, but in terms of the connection between the truth and the individual consciousness.
No, well, this goes back to Omer's point of they have to be part of the corporate body.
In his mind.
Yes.
But if you turn him on his head, and you
Right.
say, well, let's look at it more broadly,
Right. Corpus mysticum, more generally.
or just dispose with the corporate context. We're in a democratic period. Then, in fact,
No, I mean, this is-
individual opinions are sacred in that sense.
So this is what he does in the King's Two Bodies with England, with the transformation to switching from sovereignty of just the sovereign monarch at the head to when Parliament becomes kind of more constitutive, essential. That the people, their will are embodied in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the monarch just becomes a figurehead after that for Kantorovich. And so he does ultimately go there. Now, there are people who try to, someone like Foucault, for example, take Kantorovich and spread him into that kind of radical democratic kind of point of critique. But I don't know. You can see that Kantorovich thinks that there's something pretty special about scholars, that the average person on the street is not entitled to the same level of dignity and humanity. There's not that sacral element that they're committing their lives to because they have to work for a living. They have to, they're engaged in just material world without transformation as the end. But I like your pushing. This is ultimately, I like, as a political theorist, I think I'd like to try to figure out, are there democratic potentials for this model? Although, yeah, okay. Oh, like Richard Ashcroft. Oh, Priestley, okay.
Hi, I'm Issa. I'm a senior studying history in IAPA.
What is IAPA?
International and Public Affairs.
Okay.
Sorry, it's so long, long name. And I was wondering how Kantorovich's ideal of freedom of speech and this sovereignty of the robe fit into maybe more centralized academic systems today that might tend to promote a more singular historical narrative, and can university professors and scholars then still be expected to act as autonomous sources of information if they themselves were brought up and educated within a system that was still highly regulated by the state?
Wow. No, it's a great. I have to think. Yeah. No, it's. No, right. I'm trying to, the obverse side of that question, I'm trying to, I mentioned that Wendy Brown book. If she has been this critic of what's been happening to public universities over the last decade or two, that public funding from the state has been diminished and diminished and diminished. And that's why I get rising fees, that public universities, now students need to take massive loans in order to go to public universities. But I think your question, like, so for example, like UC Berkeley, for example, would your question be that if Berkeley is so dependent on the state for okay. Right, I mean, right, or even, I mean, as
I think of another country whose problem.
right, so in states where universities are state universities, like in Israel, or say, you mentioned Germany, you have these problems of the state interfering with what are legitimate kind of academic questions and events and forms of speech, and questions of disciplining students and faculty for participating in things that are not authorized, that go against law. And even in America, I think things are heading that way with the Civil Rights Act now, with the definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition, where you have not only civil lawsuits against universities for not protecting students against anti-Semitism, which is understood as anti-Zionism, or even criticism of Israel could be considered to be anti-Semitic, or also the Department of Education is now starting to look into opening up investigations, along with other agencies, along with the same definition of anti-Semitism that comes in under the Civil Rights Act, under Article 6. I mean, I can see it's well-meaning in terms of protecting against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but when these things become kind of weaponized by state power, especially within university, that's where that Kantorovich within me gets a little bit nervous. No, but it's a confluence of these things. Because the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is adopted by something like 19 EU states over the last 4 years. The United States was kind of late in the game in adopting that definition. So something independent is going on. Yes, finance, the role of finance in education is something important, but there's also something else going on about state power, even in apparently decentralized places like the United States. I mean, Germany, Israel, much easier to track these things just because they are arms of the state. I'm excluding private universities in Israel, but even there, we find similar phenomena.
Can I just say, there's something here that I'm really interested in. So first of all, I mean, you have one model, which is a sort of corporate, the university is a corporation, which is a deeply, like the Georgia Circle, is also a deeply conservative concept It's a self-declared elite that maintains its own freedom within its own domain. It's not about freedom to the world. It's,
Right.
it's
Inner
own
sovereignty.
Inner sovereignty.
Right.
So it can be inner institutional, it can be innerlich, sort of within itself for each member, right? That has a potential, which is what happens with the Kreisau people, with the Georgia people, and Kantorovich and others, of becoming also enamored of a particular state and a particular organization of power. So it has, in fact, a highly undemocratic potential, right? So it's between one kind of freedom, which is what many Germans called at the time sort of inner Widerstand, the internal resistance to Nazism.
Right, spiritual
We didn't say
resistance.
anything
Right,
because it was dangerous, but inwardly we always hated the system.
right.
And that has these kind of origins. It goes back to this notion of inner freedom,
Yep.
which is a very powerful one. The other one, you're talking about the corporate university, not the corporation, but the corporate university. And that's what we see in the United States very much as well, right? And there, the protection is supposed to be academic freedom, which is not freedom of speech. There's a little bit of slippage between the two. It's academic freedom, right? So you have tenure. What is academic freedom? Is tenure. You can't be fired unless you do certain things. Generally, you can't be fired, although you may increasingly be threatened with being fired because that's who says that there's a contract there. That is the one that we see now. That is that because it becomes a corporate system, the people who do not wear the gowns are the people who are those who represent the corporation
Right.
in that sense, in the sort of economic sense, right? And so, in a sense, what you're sketching are two different models, and they both have something very powerful in them and attractive, and both you can see the inner contradictions of them, right?
No, you're absolutely right. That these in the fundamental issue, he lays out those two models where one he criticizes the university as that what you describe as the corporate model. He keeps talking about business corporations, that we are not that. But nevertheless, he wants to preserve this more mystical notion, which is a conservative notion, of a corporate body. That's the medieval. That's also the George Christ. This is corpus mysticum, and like the doctrine of the king's two bodies that he ends up publishing a few years later. That we are the essential component of that body, the one that lives for posterity and eternity. These other people are mere accessories. And yes, we need money to work, and we need buildings, and we need administrators to run things, but they don't partake in that.
They serve us.
They serve us, we don't serve them. You're right, that's the fundamental through line of that contradiction that he's trying to play out. And it's hilarious. So he also he sends a copy of this to Felix Frankfurter, who was sitting on the Supreme Court. The who's who in these things are fascinating. Earl Warren was the anti-communist governor at this time in California. He hadn't become the liberal Supreme Court justice yet. So Earl Warren is the one who pushed this loyalty oath. But Justice Felix Frankfurter is amazed with Kantorovich. And the case ultimately gets decided in favor of the faculty by the California State Supreme Court. It never goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. But he was fired from his position when he could have had other jobs. But he, as a principal, he wanted to stay with it. And then he lands on his feet by getting invited to go to the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. A pretty nice soft landing. But yeah. But, yeah.
Last question? You forgot a question. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I was going to ask, in times of war, have there been and are there any legitimate reasons to suppress academic freedom for like public safety?
Some people say that.
Yeah. No, so I think at least the Kantorovich of 49 to 51 would say that the university might need to do basic policing of behavior, but these things should be left to not just faculty but also students, because students wear the gown. But this was before, the 60s kick in. I think he would have been shocked by some of the free speech. He didn't believe in free speech just for free speech. They aren't part of that essential corporate
It's
body.
academic freedom. It's not
Right.
freedom.
It's right, and that's what's the non-American element here of that freedom understood as something affirming in something that can be more in terms of liberation, rather than you can't stop me. It's not a question of limiting. It's actualizing potential. But so I don't know. So if like Isaiah Berlin wrote a famous essay on two concepts of liberty, one is a negative conception of liberty, and one is a positive. I think Americans are more comfortable with negative conceptions of liberty, like the Second Amendment. If you're a strong Second Amendment person for guns, hands off my guns. You can't. So it's what restrictions are there? Rather than, how can we transform this freedom into something even greater? Although maybe that's shifting too in terms of populist movements, and maybe there is a more positive, a turn towards positive freedom. I can't call it liberty then, but yeah, it's a great question though. So, the problem is in times of war, conformity there's an incredible pressure for people to get along the same page, especially you mentioned Israel, to bring it to Israel-Gaza. We were attacked. We all have to be on the same page. It's existential survival. This is 1948 over again. It's and we're going to send our children to serve, and we can't allow this to happen again. Never again. That's a lot of pressure to kind of withstand and say, well, wait a minute, let's think about things and make way for dissident voices within the university. In times of war, things get really pressed, and I think for understandable social, political, and emotional reasons as well. You guys have had to live. Emotions run high on these issues, and people get dug in terms of their emotional commitments. And so when you enter an academic space, like, no one's raised their voice. Now, granted, I brought in Kantorovich. I didn't deal with Israel-Gaza, but there's a certain amount of kind of sobriety needed sometimes to kind of unlock certain intellectual possibilities, which, if you're dealing with the passions of the moment, it's tough to have that tranquility of mind to make way to actually listen to people and have a real exchange of ideas. He would not have been. You're right, though, that even in not times of crisis, not just war, he was not against police power. I have no idea how he would respond to COVID. I mean, I can tell you, Hegel, for example, justified the use of vaccines during a cholera pandemic in 1830. Not that Kantorovich was Hegelian, but there is precedent, and certainly in medieval times in terms of trying to protect against epidemics. That was quite common.
I have a
Oh, censorship. Right. I don't think he was worried about censorship. He was, I think, more worried about this indignity of you're making me affirm that I have never been a communist. I am not a communist. I won't be a communist. I'm Mr. Anti-Communist, but I won't affirm that. I won't sign this loyalty oath. It's beneath me, because he thinks there's something toxic about oaths themselves, loyalty oaths themselves, which he's learned through painful life experience.
Because the external loyalty is your sensitivity. And that's your prerogative and your consequence, your sovereignty.
Right, your conscience, your judgment.
To your question, I can think of two examples, though. One is a direct thing, like the government stopped publication of some nuclear physics research during World War II until after the war. But I think the bigger issue is self-censorship. Like during times of war, like I remember reading this article, and I think a Middle East Studies professor at Brown wrote or stated that like the atmosphere right now is like it was like after 9/11. And I think that's like the bigger issue.
Yeah, and in a climate of intellectual chilling,